Good morning, I'm Father Ryan Humphries. Welcome to the CateCast. And this week, we continue our series on the books of the Bible with the first and second books of Maccabees. Now, in most Bibles, the books of Maccabees conclude the Old Testament. So we're a little bit out of order here. But both books seem, superficially at least, to be historical books. They're trying to be wisdom books. There's a bit of a back and forth and debate about what they actually are. But because I think that they're a lot closer to history books than they are to wisdom books, I find it a lot easier to think about the books of Maccabees in conjunction with all the history books we've been going through now, from Joshua all the way through Kings and Chronicles, all the way to this moment. And this will be the end of the books that are history-like, whether they are formally speaking history books or not. Next week is Job, which is definitely a wisdom book. And so the books of Maccabees constitute kind of middle ground. Now, I have to say, I've been a priest for coming on 17 years. This is the first time I have ever taught anything about the books of Maccabees. I look back through my stuff, I gave one sermon, I think in 2011, on the little passage about the mother and her 7 sons, but otherwise, nobody ever talks about Maccabees. I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon or a teaching on Maccabees, and other than seminary, I don't know that I've ever read anything about Maccabees. So while it's super important to the Jewish community, because it's the foundation of the Hanukkah celebration, we as Catholics just don't spend a lot of time thinking about Maccabees. Maybe that's because they're the poster child for the deuterocanonical books that Martin Luther couldn't translate and left out of the Bible. I don't know. But here's my first go at it, and so we'll just see how it works. Now, the first thing to understand is that First Maccabees is a book that kind of tells a specific story. Second Maccabees is a prequel to that story. So you have a rhetorical device where you have one book that is set, kind of in its own time, and then the second book is set 25 years earlier. And so there is a certain amount of confusion that they're not out of order. You kind of need to read them in that order, but the first one tells a story, and then the second one adds context and adds color to the story. It's difficult to read them in the other order because then you get pieces you don't understand what's happening, you don't understand why this is going on, and there's the various story of these different kings, all of whom have the same basic name, Antiochus IV, Antiochus V, and it can be relatively mind-bending to try to read them out of order. So Maccabees 2 is written about 25 years before Maccabees 1 was written. Maccabees 1 was written in 100 BC, give or take. Maccabees 2 was written about 125 BC, give or take. Now, both of them were written by Palestinian Jews. These are Jews who live north of Jerusalem, kind of outside the Jewish center in what we might call the diaspora, those Jews who are living kind of out of the core of the Jewish culture. And each of them are written by different authors. So it's a very, very confusing thing, and it's not an accident. I guess I've never taught about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because it's deeply confusing to try to explain what's happening and why. Now, both books were originally written, we think, in Hebrew. Both are only preserved in Greek. It influences why Martin Luther was not able to translate them. Both books are essentially books that are trying to take a very confusing political situation and explain it through the lens of religion, which is not always helpful, but it's still important and good because that political situation matters quite a bit. Now, we have to add that First Maccabees doesn't seem to have any source beyond the author. The author and the events, he wrote it, and that's what we have. Second Maccabees, though, is drawing on a very well-known and understood work of literature by a guy named Jason of Cyrene, no relation to Simon, and his work was written in North Africa. And so we have this sense where First Maccabees is a guy trying to tell the events of the story, whereas Second Maccabees is written earlier from a fixed text, and he's kind of editing down and collating some of that work. So there's a great deal of kind of difficulty when you look at this from the point of view of a scholar or a biblical scholar. For us reading, thanks be to God, we don't have to worry about most of that. As far as the reading goes, you can read First Maccabees, you read Second, and you go, I think I've already looked at this. I've already noticed that. Oh yeah, that's already happened. But you still don't have to worry too hard about all these details. You do, though, have to have some idea of the political background that's going on. And when we say political, it can be a little confusing because we're not talking about, the game of politics that we have in the world today. We're talking about just the way the world was for the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. So just by way of a very, very thumbnail sketch of what happened, about 300 years BC, we've all heard of Alexander the Great. Well, Alexander the Great drops dead. And so he unwisely divides his empire among the 3 top generals under his command. It's a complete disaster. It's considered one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of the world. But the 2 big players, the 2 biggest of them, are one of his generals who's named Ptolemy, and he takes the Egyptian chunk of Alexander's Macedonian Empire. And then the other guy, Seleucus, takes Syria and kind of just this side of Iran and a lot of the Middle East, the big kind of core of the wealthy Middle East. Seleucus takes over, and it becomes the Seleucid Empire. And in Egypt, you have the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, the Jews are sandwiched in between those 2 empires, which is never a good place to be, and they would very much like to be free, thank you very much, but these 2 giant empires are simply not going to let that happen, and so you end up with this situation where the Jews are in the middle of this culture war, where both of these great empires, the Ptolemaic in Egypt and the Seleucid in modern-day Libya, or in modern-day Syria, are kind of pressing in with this idea of modernization through the use of Greek culture. Now, it seems bizarre for us to think of Egypt and Syria as 2 Greek powerhouses, but at the time, remember, this is Alexander the Great. He had taken the Macedonian kind of empire, and which was Greek. It was Proto-Greek, and it was like, this is the new good stuff. Alexander was young and cocky, and so his generals who took over these empires were trying to push that same kind of cultural agenda of this Greek first way of thinking, and that created a lot of drama for the Jews who were stuck in the middle of it. And so in 175 BC, 175, that's a little less than 200 years before Jesus shows up on the scene, and it's about 100 years before, or less than 100 years before our events take place, a cat named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which is his name. This is the king who takes over the Seleucid. That's the northern of the 2 empires. And he basically outlaws Jewish religion. He decides we're going to go ahead and take the next step forward. We're going to go a bit like our Canadian friends to the north and just decide to become the iron fist of we're going to put our woke agenda in. And so the Seleucid Empire basically says anything that's not us is out. And in fact, he goes so far as to bring a pagan idol and put on the altar in the middle of the temple of Solomon. Well, of course, that's a problem. The Jewish people don't like that. It's a big, big issue. And so at the head of an organized revolt against this situation, a family led by Mattathias, not Matthias, but Mattathias, whose nickname is the Hammer. Hard to beat that, right? Charles Martel and Mattathias the Hammer. It's a great nickname. He is going to show up, and by the way, the Hammer translates to Maccabees. So the names are associated with the Hammer. And so that's why we call him the Maccabees. He is going to start, he and his family, his extended family, are going to start a serious revolt with this powerful emperor king of this empire, and it's going to be a guerrilla war. And it's going to be long, and it's going to be violent, and it's going to be brutal, and ultimately the Maccabees are going to win. That's going to be great. We're all very excited, and they're going to form a dynasty that is going to be called the Hasmonean dynasty, which is going to rule Jerusalem, rule the Jewish state for a good number of years. They're going to be an important and powerful empire, but they're going to ultimately fall apart right before Jesus shows up on the scene. But a lot of the politics and drama that we see with people like Judas the Iscariot, who is a radical, or Barsabbas, who is released in place of Jesus at the crucifixion, these are people who want to kind of bring back this brutal dynasty to kick out the new problem problem, which is the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. So I know that's a lot of different names and dates and things like that, but the brief idea is right before the events of our stories, two great empires have arisen somewhat suddenly. Both of them are actively threatening the Jewish culture, and right before things get going, the northernmost of those in Syria has come in and gone full-on Committee for Public Safety, French Revolution, established a pagan idol on the altar, and so the people simply cannot handle it anymore, and the family of the Hammer comes in to wage guerrilla warfare against this unacceptable blasphemy against God. That's the kind of the prequel setup. And so here's the play-by-play, which is thankfully relatively simple. Starting with 1 Maccabees. So chapter 1 of 1 Maccabees, about 175 to 164. This is right at the beginning. Antiochus comes onto the throne. This is the bad king. In chapter 2, which is all in 166 BC, Mattathias begins the revolt. The hammer has come down. And then chapters 3 through 9 are the following 6 years, where Jonathan becomes the high priest, or I should say where the Judas Maccabeus becomes the commander, the holy war ensues, and now we have a great deal of violence. This is the action movie part of the book, chapters 3 through 9. It's chapter 9 through 12, which is 160 through 143, that Jonathan becomes the high priest, and it really becomes a holy war. It starts to become not just let's get rid of these jerks, but this is for the good of God, for the good of our religion, for this, in order that God may be glorified, we need to do this, and it becomes something much, much more religious. Chapters 13 through 16, this is 143 to 134 BC. Simon becomes the new high priest, and he becomes the architect of the Hasmonean dynasty. And then the last little chunk of the book is from 134 to 104, and a guy named John Hyrcanus I succeeds the Maccabees and becomes, the king of the Hasmoneans. So don't worry about the fact that all those numbers just got thrown at you. Don't fret. I can email it to you if you really want to know. But the basic overarching story is relatively simple. Antiochus shows up. Matthias is not going to put up with his garbage anymore. There is a war. Then the religious community gets really engaged with the war. It becomes something much more like jihad. And then we have, kind of a succession of leaders who we use to date the events. But the whole thing takes place between 175 BC and 104 BC. And the book was written in about 100 BC. And we should say this is deeply accurate history. The Jews are using this as the basis for Hanukkah. This is something that has been studied, and studied again. There is nothing in the Old Testament that is historically vetted as the events that we see here. And so this is an accurate book of history. This is not Joshua did some stuff within 100 years of this date, Joshua walked in this area, maybe, possibly, sorta. This is extremely accurate history. So we finished the first book of Maccabees. Then the second book of Maccabees picks up, and we jump way back. We jump back, and we start with a couple of letters and forewords in chapter 1. But then in chapter 3, we jump way back to the 180s BC, right before Antiochus shows up on the scene, and we get a little bit more context of what's going on. We get this kind of wonderful and bizarre story of this guy named Heliodorus, and I'll leave that to you to enjoy at the beginning of Second Maccabees 3. But we get this kind of establishing stuff for the first 3 chapters, and then for roughly the rest of the book, which overlaps. Chapters 4 to chapter 15 overlaps with 1 Maccabees, and we're getting the desecration of the temple. We're getting, we have some bad high priests. We get a martyrology, which lays out the folks who died along the way. We get Judas hammering some folks. We get the purification of the temple. And each of these different books is telling roughly the same story, but it's telling it for 2 different purposes and giving 2 different perspectives. It's worth noting that both of these books are written to legitimatize extraordinary events. One of them is very much about the events that took place, violent as they were necessary. And the other one is saying, look, the Hasmonean dynasty is illegitimate. We know they're illegitimate. None of them are successors of David. None of them have any royal blood, but they did what they had to do. And so we got to give them at least enough credit for that and say, look, they're not trying to run the world by force and fire. They're just trying to kind of make sure that nobody comes in and destroys the temple. So cut them some slack, you bunch of jerks. I mean, that's kind of the way that the stories are trying to play out. One is just saying, look, we did what we had to do. We weren't more violent than we had to be, so lay off. And the other is saying, look, don't just leave the king alone. Yes, we know he doesn't have the blood. Just shut up. We're dealing with what we can deal with, and when the time comes, he'll let go. But just chill out. Just chill out. That's a lot of the way these books are trying to kind of paint the picture. Beyond the political, though, both books are careful to show God's providence. They're careful to show that the blasphemy being done, even though it's being done without Jewish consent, still falls onto the Jewish shoulders. It's still a sin that the Jews commit unless they're doing something to defend the temple, and God is providing for that because, look, there's this giant army, and this small group of people who are literally named after hammers managed to run them off. And so God is good. God is providing what he needs to do, and it's remarkable. And of course, that's been a theme that we've seen from the last several books of the Bible that we've done. But the Maccabees is really interesting in that regard. It's a history book, but it's a history book that is trying to say, look, we know the ideals and the wonderful what could be's, but here's the real world, and we've got to take responsibility because God is our God, and he's brought us through all this stuff, so we're doing the best we can, and if you think you can do it better, then you run for office and you try to figure it out. You know, it's very much a book where you can kind of sense in some passages where the author is going, just please, just please. And you can see this is all ending in 100 BC, and so it's not all that odd in the ancient world, at least, for people at the time of Jesus, 100 years later, to look up and say, we're still trying to put up with this nonsense. We finally got the Seleucids and the Ptolemies out, but that was only because Rome conquered them. And now Rome is doing the exact same thing that they were doing. Rome's got a governor here who's doing all this crazy pagan stuff. And so it's exactly the same way as it was 100 years ago. And so you've got these kind of people who are called political radicals, but there were not one, not two, but three separate Jewish wars against the Romans. And so the Maccabees is not something that's completely out of left field. And in fact, modern day Jews would look at those three great Jewish wars against the Romans in the context of the Maccabean wars and say, look, this is just what the Jews have been trying to do. And in fact, those ideas set up exactly what Israel is going through right now, saying we've been putting up with this garbage quite literally from the beginning. We had the Assyrians, then we had the Persians, then we had the Babylonians, then we had the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic, and then we had the Romans, and then we had all the Islam, and now we still have Islam trying to destroy Israel. And so just back off. You know, if you have problems with the way I'm doing things, I'll launch a nuclear missile at your face. Just back off. And you can see how in our conception, history is very, very compressed. Right, we look back at the 70s as if it is ancient history. I was talking to some friends last night about music, and they were like, yeah, the 60s, gosh, that so long ago. And I'm going, not as long as you think. I mean, I wasn't born then, but I mean, it's not that long. But in cultures where the building over there is 1,400 years old, the 70s are not ancient history. In fact, the 1670s and the 1270s are not as ancient of history as they might seem to us. And so when we think about how important these matters are, it's difficult to use the word politics because this is not really politics in the way that we think of it, where we're bickering about whether or not some guy gets elected and, that's usually a Democrat seat and he got elected as a Republican. This is life or death politics that's been going on for thousands of years. And for the Jewish people, victims of the Holocaust and victims of other things, this is something that is very, very real to them and something that is the foundation of their entire cultural identity. And so it is worth reading the books of Maccabees in that kind of way of thinking. Jesus shows up on the scene. And this is not just history. This is the way they're still living their lives, because the Roman Empire is just as much a threat as Ptolemy and Seleucid Empire was before, and just as much of a threat as the Babylonians and the Assyrians were before that. And so there's a very, very kind of sense of visceralness to the battles taking place. And so while we can be a little bit funny with them, there's a this informs the Gospels very, very directly in terms of their history. And so I also want to add, just as a little aside, once you read these books, you get a little bit better picture of what Hanukkah is about. This is kind of where Hanukkah kind of develops from. And in fact, the story of the Maccabees is still told at Hanukkah. And so if you have any Jewish friends, they're likely to know some wonderful poetic little stories about the Maccabees, some of which don't actually even appear in the book. I do want to just add, too, as a final kind of note, that the Maccabees are not that controversial. I mean, you talk to some of our Baptist friends, and they act like it's, some kind of deep, evil book. Even the idea of praying for the dead is not that controversial. I mean, even our hardcore Baptist friends can't give any meaningful reason why we shouldn't pray for the dead. They might say, well, Mama's already in heaven, but why wouldn't you pray, for folks who have died, especially those who have just died? It's a really kind of bizarre thing that we have this idea that the Maccabees are such a threatening type of book when they're really not. It's really just providing context for what's going on. And so I think it's worth kind of remembering just at the back of our minds that the Maccabees is a book that's important for context. It has a few verses of things that we might reference and say, oh, this is an interesting thing that we don't see elsewhere, but it's not like if you don't believe in Maccabees, you don't believe in purgatory. And it's not like purgatory depends upon our reading of Maccabees or anything like that at all. And so I think that's it. That's all there is to say. That's my first time making my way through Maccabees. I thought about adding the third and fourth books of Maccabees, which are not in our Bible, but which are in the Bibles of the Russian church, the Ukrainian Catholic church, the Coptics over in Ethiopia, and a lot of the Eastern churches have third and fourth books of Maccabees, which once I realized how difficult it was going to be just to merge these two, I said, there's no way I'm going to add 3 and 4. But you can get copies of 3 and 4 on the internet if you're interested. And none of them are long. They're 15, 20 chapters apiece. And so you could read in a day, in one sitting, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And if you were just interested, you could go to the internet and read 3rd and 4th Maccabees. They are not bad books. They don't have any drama with them. It's just further context about the Hanukkah, about the wars that took place, and further context about what goes on in the gospel. So if you do have any questions, I'll answer those right after the feed falls. Thank you for joining us on the CU CateCast this week. Next time, it is the book of Job. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. Have a good evening.